Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial, the Psychology of Identity. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we are going to be quickly looking at the Ladinos. Now, many people are familiar with Latino with a T. This is Ladino with a D, and we are going to be looking at the history of this particular ethnic group known as Ladinos. We're going to look at the history and the dispersion of the Ladinos into the Americas. And what we're going to also be looking at is the transplanting of Ladino culture and these brotherhood organizations, these very confusing and confounding brotherhood or fraternal organizations from Europe/Africa to the Americas. Now, in terms of transplanting this culture into the Americas, in terms of mainland America, the focus would be on the southeastern portion of the United States and then the southwest or the western portion. And if this appears on anything other than Dr. Tracy McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Now we're going to start off with some research from the National Park Service, and then we're going to look at some confirmation of their research coming out of Spain related to the Ladinos and the dispersion of the Ladinos and the carrying on of that culture through these fraternal/brotherhood organizations into the Americas. Okay, let's talk about the Ladinos. The Ladinos were basically free or enslaved, Hispanicized people of African descent. And so not just Latino, but these were individuals who were of African descent, who were what you would consider Hispanic. And so what is Hispanic now, or what is understood as Hispanic now, what was understood as Hispanic then is slightly different. And so basically, individuals who were coming from Spain, who also were brown people, would be identified as Ladinos. You also had other groups that were the ones who would sort of be what you would consider the field slaves, and you have the house slaves. And so those individuals would be doing that sort of back-breaking work. Those individuals were also considered the vanguard. And I've heard some people sort of bragging about that identity of being the vanguard. The vanguard is basically the sacrificial lamb. The vanguard is basically the miner's canary. The vanguard is the one that is sent out front. They are that front line of defense. They are that front line in terms of war. They are the first to go. They are the pawns on the chessboard. And so while some individuals may, feel very esteemed by that identity, it is that sort of sacrificial identity. Now, Ladino is also related to language, and it is the language of Spanish Moors, Spanish Jews in Spain. It's a language that they used. And then you also have the people, the Ladino people. And so the first Africans in Spain were known as Ladinos, or those Hispanicized Africans. These individuals, it's important to note that they were soldiers, servants, settlers, and enslaved. And so they played multiple roles. And so it's important to not just pigeonhole people or make assumptions about people when you see African explorers in Spanish America, or you see that Africans were in Spanish America. It's not wise to assume that they were all enslaved. Many of them were conquistadors and were enslavers themselves. Now, this is when it really gets interesting, when they are talking about the Afro-Hispanic space, and this was what they considered African people, free and enslaved African people in the social spaces in the Iberian Peninsula. And it's very interesting because there's a notation about these ethnic enclaves. And not only were there ethnic enclaves, but there were religious fraternities specifically for people of African descent. And so during this time, they had, aid societies. There was a hospital created for people of African descent, and it was built by the church. Very interesting dynamic. This whole idea of African fraternities in Spain. What's really interesting about this is that these African fraternities made their way into the Americas, and so these African fraternities continue to exist. These Spanish African fraternities continue to exist in the Americas. That includes mainland America, so Spanish Americas. Now, this is a very interesting notation related to this brotherhood dynamic for Africans in Spain, so these Spanish African brotherhoods. And so this is basically an African or Negro brotherhood in Spain. And so you have, that's what that means, basically, this Negrito brotherhood. What's interesting is the depiction that goes along with this. This is not in the Americas what would be considered a Negro brotherhood or a fraternal organization for Negritos. And so it's very interesting that this is the depiction, this is the advertisement. No, this is not a joke. This is a legitimate organization here. And so again, it's very interesting notation, something to think about. Perhaps someone can do a little bit more research on it to get a better handle on this, this idea of this being a fraternal order for Negritos. And again, of course, it could be that the idea of Negrito varies from place to place, and that this makes perfect sense in this particular context. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, fraternal basically means brotherhood. And in translating some old documents from Spanish into English, this is affirmed. And so you have, this is again the National Park Service noting now that through the aid of these fraternal organizations, and you can see words that suggest that you're talking about Black, that through these fraternities, they were able to provide food and supplies for needy people who were of African descent. And so African descent in Spain, and you see the notation there that Spain's African brotherhoods, provided critical social services for their communities. One thing to make note of is when you were thinking about this is that these brotherhoods would have been transplanted to the southeastern portion of the United States and the western portion of the United States. And so you would see manifestations of that in those areas. And now you see another depiction of this Negritos brotherhood. And again, it's a very interesting dynamic, and you have to remember that in certain cultures, in terms of being culturally competent, something may have one meaning in one culture, and a depiction or symbols or signs may have another meaning in a totally different culture. And so again, it would be helpful if someone would consider doing a little bit more research to get a better understanding of these brotherhoods that the National Park Service is talking about, and also this organization, the Spanish organization that exists. And here you see some interesting notations again, where they are explaining that officials of African descent were appointed as overseers in terms of community well-being, and that there was an individual who was a Black man of noble descent, we're talking about 1475, was appointed judge and mayor of the Blacks and Browns in the Seville area. And this was whether individuals were free or enslaved. And this was reported as similar to how individuals who were identified as Muslim or Jew were treated. They were able to have their own communities with their own laws and their own policies to govern their respective communities. And here you see additional information related to these social and religious institutions and these mayors or these officials that were over these neighborhoods and these communities. And then you see the notation that Africans sustained fraternal and community identities, and they reproduced these traditional social and cultural practices. And that eventually you see that these came to, you see down at the bottom, this was carried over into the New World. Okay, now we have quickly covered the origin of the Ladino and the Ladino culture. We've looked at the history of Ladinos in Spain and the dispersion of this particular culture into the Americas. And it's important to remember that in terms of Ladinos, the majority of Ladinos, when they came over, they were not enslaved. In fact, they were considered conquistadors, they were settlers, they were colonizers. And so we've also looked at this way that the Ladinos were able to hold on to their culture, that Afro-Hispanic culture, and transplant that into the Americas through these Negritos or Negro brotherhoods. Now, of course, these brotherhoods don't look like what would be considered Negrito or Negro brotherhoods in America, meaning mainland America. However, again, sometimes what something means in one culture may mean something totally different in another culture.